All muscle is not the same. We often just grab a piece of meat and we say the meat from this part of the animal is the same as from a different part. And it's actually not true at all. In fact, muscle is a collection of different cell types that metabolize energy differently and they contract at different speeds.
Welcome to MeatsPad, a platform to share breakthrough knowledge that is accessible to the entire meat industry. Be ready to hear from meat specialists who will talk about numerous topics in meat science, including animal welfare, meat production, meat quality, and so much more.
This podcast is brought to you by the Niche Meat Processor Assistance Network, the national provisioner.
Dry Age Pro makes dry aging in-house flexible, safe, and affordable.
And Ultrasource, the new standard for innovation.
Since 1883, Ultrasource has been a trusted supplier to the food industry. Ultrasource provides superior kill floor, processing, packaging, and labeling equipment and operational supplies.
Hello, meat folks. Welcome to the MeatsPad podcast. My name is Francisco Najar. I'm your host today. How is everyone doing? I'm very excited because we have a very good friend today on our podcast. I'm happy and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. David Gerrard. He is a professor and department head of animal and poultry science at Virginia Tech. Welcome, Dr. Gerrard. How are you today?
Good, Francisco, and it's great to see you during this pandemic. I hope everything's nice at K-State.
Absolutely. Well, we have a very special episode. We'll talk some of the factors that impact meat quality. We'll try to put it in a very layman's terms for our audience to understand more when we have a meat processor that are listening to this podcast, and we start talking about some of the difference between muscles and meat that really gets that organoleptic characteristics. And I think we'll touch on fiber type, some of the difference between red meat and white meat. So it's going to be pretty interesting. But before we start off this conversation, Dr. Gerrard, just tell us a little bit about yourself, about your career. Who is Dr. Gerrard?
Well, I'd love to. You know, I was born in northern Indiana, just a farm boy, and I went to Purdue University and studied, and my educational pedigree looks like a telephone pole because I got all 3 degrees at Purdue University. And I left there and I went to the University of Missouri, a fine place, then returned to Purdue University and tried to assemble a pretty good meat science program there, and then left to become the department head at Virginia Tech. We still have a pretty large research program. We currently have about 6 PhDs in our program here. It's a federally funded program, and Francisco, as you mentioned, it's a pretty fundamental program, but I think we can explain some of these fundamental programs and the application of those studies to the application of meat quality and animal growth and development. So that's kind of where I am, my friend.
Yeah, and you've been very humble. When we talk about yourself, I know we had some conversations. You've been to France for some time. That could be considered your second language.
Well, I don't know. I can order a beer in French, but I'd like to think I've spent as much time in the southern hemisphere in South America. That's really an amazing continent, and we really look towards helping them as we try to feed the 9 billion people in the world in 2050, because there's a lot of capacity there, and we really enjoy working with those folks about developing their agriculture.
Which countries have you been at in South America?
Brazil quite a bit. I work with those folks pretty extensively. Just visited Argentina last fall, and then of course I was a Fulbright scholar in Uruguay. And so I've got some friends there. It's a great place.
Yeah, I mean, and I think one of the most important things that we're missing today is there is a famous book, The Principles of Meat Science, that Dr. Gerrard is a co-author. And I think you're pretty famous. So
I'm probably famous for a lot more than I'd like to get into on this podcast.
all right, let's talk a little bit about meat science. I know we have some content to go over, but just I guess to start this conversation, please tell us a little bit about your work. It's been related to some of the biochemical factors that play a role in meat and has an impact on other characteristics like tenderness, color. Tell us more about from your experience. What do you think when we talk about meat quality from your perspective?
Yeah, my PhD was actually in bovine myogenesis, and I studied double muscling. And after I got done at Purdue, and of course all three educations at Purdue, and being only 50 miles from the home farm, I really needed to snap the umbilical cord, for lack of a better term. And so I reached out to some labs in Europe to study myogenesis, because at that time it was pretty hard to get double muscled cattle. And so I finally I got an invitation to go to a French lab, Institution Nationale de Recherche Agronomique, which is a comparison to the USDA labs that we have in the United States. And when I was there and working on a study, they did a lot of what's called fiber typing. And fiber typing is essentially slicing the muscle really, really thinly, and then identifying each cell, right? And whether it has what kind of energy metabolism, whether it uses glucose predominantly or whether it uses fat. And the proteins that are associated with those cells are really fascinating, because when you look at a picture of cross-section of muscle, it's absolutely impressive, because there's just different cell types there, and they stain differently, and it's really quite intriguing when you look at it. And I've came to realize that really meant that all muscle is not the same. We often just grab a piece of meat and we say the meat from this part of the animal is the same as from a different part. And it's actually not true at all. In fact, muscle is a collection of different cell types that metabolize energy differently, and they contract at different speeds. So for example, if you take chicken breast, for example, it is predominantly white muscle, right? And you can tell that from the color of it, because it doesn't have any pigment, right? Any pigment, the major pigment being myoglobin, which is similar to hemoglobin, which is red, that you see in blood. And so it doesn't have a lot of pigment in that tissue. As compare that to the thigh of a chicken, and the thigh has a lot more pigment in it, and consequently it functions differently. Well, the same can be said for beef, right? It's just the magnitude of the difference is not that great between muscles in the round or muscles in the longissimus dorsi. There is some variation in pork, though, if you look at the ham muscles, and oftentimes those muscles that are lighter are superficial on the ham, on the outside, and those closer to the bone are more red. And of course, they're more red because they work more often, right? So they stabilize the joint when the pig's standing. When the pig walks around, he uses those muscles that stabilize it. In the same way, in humans, the muscles around our spinal column are more red and more fatigue resistant, right? And when we say fatigue resistant, it means they can work better. I always use this example in class. If anyone's ever picked up a chicken, I said, what does a chicken do? And the chicken beats the tar out of you with its wings for about 2 seconds. And then the wings flop back and it says, eat me, right? It's because they're fatigable. So the breast muscle is very fatigable. If you compare that to the thighs still work. But even compare that to duck breast, right? Duck breast is red meat, as is goose breast meat, because it's fatigue resistant, because those are migratory birds and they have to use those breast muscles to fly long distances and become and they're fatigue resistant. So this whole idea that the type of muscle is related to quality, I think is emerging in the literature. I have some students that have graduated and gone to different universities and are running research programs, and certainly the energy metabolism that's used in those individual fibers can affect tenderness, can affect protease abilities. In fact, Dr. Scheffler at the University of Florida has noticed that the zebu cattle regulate energy differently because of the energy metabolism that occurs in some of that muscle.
Wow.
And likewise, Solomon Matarne at Utah State, another one of my good students, has just shown that the type of myosin, and when I say myosin, that's a predominant muscle protein that makes cells work, is different in cattle that are more tender. So I think the data is emerging, especially in the beef, that it's related to tenderness and ultimate eating quality of beef.
Great. No, I think this is pretty interesting and really helps to just to lay out some of the conversation that we have here in a couple of more minutes. But you mentioned pretty importantly red fibers, and we'll start talking about white fibers and red fibers. And so when we talk about sensory, what does that mean for the meat industry or meat processors? Like they trying to digest this information.
Well, you have to be a little bit careful. You have to be a little bit careful because red muscle generally oxidizes fat or utilizes fat more readily. There's fat within the cell, which is intracellular fat. Then there's marbling as we know it, which is deposited between the cells, right? As intramuscular fat. That's a different kind of a scenario because in one case, the lipids in the cells, because the cells metabolize it. In another case where animals are overfed, for lack of a better term, they begin to deposit that wherever they can in the muscle as intramuscular fat or marbling. So one of them, it's a little bit of a different scenario where one's depositing fat within the totality of the musculature because of overnutrition. And the other way is the red muscle, because that's the energy that it uses, deposits it in the cell. But it certainly does have a different organoleptic flavor because remember, these cells in red muscle are smaller, which means they have more surface area, which means they probably have more phospholipids or the flavor compounds that are in the cell membranes, right? So it's quite a complex set of issues that go into sensory attributes of meat.
You are one of the researchers and professors that really have heavily researched this area. And I've been reading one of your most recent paper as a review by Weeks, and you're the co-author in that. And you have a very good explanation of why is that grain-fed cattle may have a different organoleptic properties that are more like grass-fed. Or will you please tell us a little bit more about that, if you will?
Yeah, that's really a good topic here in the last 3 years is when we've really been putting a little effort into it. And it's really funny because we were just talking about South America or the Southern Hemisphere, and the individual that got our lab switched away or to include beef color was a Chilean visiting scientist, and he's the primary author on that paper. And he came up to me after I talked at the International Congress of Meat Science and Technology. And of course, he spoke Spanish, but he was speaking to me in English, albeit it was more like Spanglish. And he said, Dr. Gerrard, I've got to come work in your lab. And I didn't understand about half of it, but I love folks from different countries. I think it brings a lot of diversity to the program. And I go, sure, what do you want to study? He said, I want to study beef quality. And I go, I don't know anything about beef quality or beef color, excuse me. And so I think if numbers are right, it's like $1 billion loss, just the color of beef. I don't hold me to those numbers, but it's a pretty large number. And so we started to talk about it. And of course, in the Southern Hemisphere, they feed it's forage-based feeding. It's not, you know this better than I do, Francisco, right? And so, of course, you always blame dark beef on stress or age or genetics, but I don't think anybody thinks about how they're fed. And so in a paper that we worked with Susan Duckett, another outstanding meat scientist from Clemson, she's been studying organoleptic properties of grass and grain-fed beef for years. Outstanding scientist. Anyway, I called her and, I've got this visiting scientist in my lab. I got to have samples to do something. We work in pork, right? Or that's where we started working. And I said, Susan, do you have any samples? And so I told Ariel and I were talking one day and I said, man, the way you manage these cattle has to have an effect on the color. I said, it's not all dark cutting as we know it, because dark cutting is a stress related phenomena where you don't have any energy in the muscle and the pH doesn't ever go down, right?
Right.
So she sent us a bunch of samples and we ran the myoglobin content, which is a major pigment, right? As you know. And these cattle that were grass fed had a significant amount of myoglobin, more myoglobin in them. So if you got more myoglobin, you got a darker red, right? Now, I think one of the emeriti there at K-State might argue a little bit about that. But the fact of the matter is myoglobin concentration does change between livestock. And these pHs were the ultimate pH of the meat was the same, but the myoglobin concentration was higher. So it argues that grass-fed beef is a little darker. We have a study with our colleagues in Brazil. They've done nearly the exact same thing, probably a little bit more detail, and they've gotten the same results, right? And their study was a little bit better designed because they did grass and grain, but then they did grass and grain at the same growth rate. So you could look at, well, is it just the forage or is it the growth rate? And Saulo da Silva, which you may know at the University of Sao Paulo, they've got data that support that study. So I think there's little question that while dark cutting is still an issue, in other words, if you stress an animal and they go dark, that's truly the case, but it's not the only way to get dark beef.
Sure. So you mentioned typically more higher concentration of myoglobin in grass-fed cattle. In terms of color, and more specifically for those folks that have their own slaughter facility, they also have their little shop where they will display their meat. Would you expect some discoloration differences?
Yeah, you probably know that. You probably know that data better than I do. So, but that's the interesting thing. I've told some people, and I'll give you more information than you asked, but ultimately I'll try to answer your question. That's a little bit of an issue with locally produced livestock, because sometimes it's locally produced, which meant it's not lower quality, but it's lower inputs. And generally, when you're feeding cattle and you want to sell it to a small locker, right, you want to make sure you want to make as much money as possible because the margins aren't very high. Well, the biggest cost is the amount of feed you put in it. So oftentimes when people sell freezer beef, now this may not be the case where you're located now, but certainly in other parts of the country, they'll put them out on grass and they won't get a lot of grain, or they'll get, maybe a few pounds of grain. And they'll say, oh no, they were grain finished. Well, the whole idea of the U.S. grading system back in the day was to make sure that cattle were on feed for a while because it ensured tenderness, right? It ensured flavor, right? We know that. That's very well established. But the other problem with this is oftentimes if you don't feed these cattle, then they don't brighten up very much because there's about 2 points different in the L-star value, and 2 points on an L-star value, that's probably a little bit too much science, but that's an objective way to measure color, is noticeable by the human eye. So oftentimes when you go to some of these local markets, you see some beef that's been fed locally. It's pretty dark. It's not what we normally associate with cherry red beef that we find in the markets. So I think if you're selling freezer beef and you want to make sure that you get a high quality product, they really need to have been on feed for a while. Otherwise, you're going to get some organoleptic grass-fedness. And it's okay if that's what you like. I mean, in some countries, they prefer that. In Uruguay, the stronger the flavor, the better, right?
Yeah, Brazil, Argentina, all those places.
Yeah, I mean, and the cookery method is for that. But I think for most Americans, that's a pretty strong flavor, right? Yeah. And the other thing is you got to get them on feed for a while. And I don't know what that number is. In fact, short-fed cattle, that's probably good enough, right? But we're used to 150 days on feed in some cases, right?
This is pretty valuable information for our folks that are listening. We oftentimes say, generally speaking, that muscles of locomotion, as you mentioned at the very beginning of this episode, they tend to have red fibers because the animal uses it a lot to move. But then we know that even within the shoulder, we have some muscles that are tender than others. We see that those differences between muscles in terms of tenderness, and is it that related to fiber type or not so much?
I honestly, Francisco, I doubt it in that case. And I've given this a lot of thought. I'm old enough now. I've thought about these things long enough, and you always think of the angles on everything. Well, so when you talk about tenderness, there's really the muscle protein overlap, right? That's how much protein overlaps. And what's the best example of that would be some things that happen. So if pre-rigor, if you pull a muscle off a carcass and it shortens, right? It's allowed to shorten, and you make steaks out of that, it's going to be tough because the muscle contracted, you interact more proteins together. It's a denser product. It's tough. So that's one way to do it. The other is the connective tissue element, right? And some muscles have more connective tissue than others. For example, in the shoulder, as you pointed out, there's more connective tissue in many of those muscles. But at the same time, if the muscle isn't responsible for doing a whole lot, it doesn't need a lot of connective tissue. And an example of that would be the psoas, right? The psoas flexes
the tenderloin for
some of you that might, the tenderloin muscle. It flexes the hip, and cattle don't flex their hips a lot, so it doesn't have a lot of connective tissue. And then the final thing is really this whole protease thing, or how enzymes within the meat tend to degrade them. And we age meat, which is a controlled rotting of meat, for lack of a better term. Those are not always the same from muscle to muscle, and certainly that could be related to fiber type, and I think there's some emerging data that suggests that. Again, out of the Utah State lab, Dr. Matarne, and also Dr. Scheffler at the University of Florida. And the energy metabolism, which is fiber type, is related to that. So it's entirely possible. I don't know for sure. I don't know of any data like that. But then you've got temperature issues and how the muscles are stretched on the carcass, and that all has a profound impact on muscle to muscle variation.
Good. I think we're coming almost to the end of this episode. This is a lot of information, and I hope that everyone, a lot of information, but at the same time it's in on layman's terms so that everyone can understand it. I think one of the most important questions that I've been getting from processors, maybe I had a conversation with some folks in northeastern Mexico almost 3 weeks ago. They, as you mentioned, there are some different genetics, and we tend to have more Cebu cattle. Than the age question about how old the animal has to be to, get the best quality, the best eating experience. And a lot of the cattle that it's slaughtered in the U.S. less than 30 months of age. And tender is one thing. We know that we get more tender product. Age has an impact on fiber type.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one thing I wanted to point out is these are changing over time, right? So they tend to change over time. There's a French scientist that showed these more glycolytic fibers tend to increase as a percentage with time. So they change over time. To give you the best advice on growing cattle and what weight, I think it depends a little bit on the mature size of the animal, for one. That some of them weigh 1,300 pounds, some of them weigh 1,000 pounds, and they're done. I think, relatively speaking, the most efficient thing to do is grow them fast and grow them hard, because that makes them as young as possible with as much groceries in them. And at least in North America, at least germane to the United States, that's used to fed cattle, get them there as fast as possible. The difference in probably in Mexico and in South America for sure, there's a little bit of you got to get the most efficiency out of them. So if you slaughtered cattle, let's say Nelore cattle from Brazil or eared cattle somewhere, if you slaughter them too young, you don't harvest as much forage that way, right? Which means you don't make as much money. But that's why I think it's fascinating to know the management strategies for different countries in the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere are really quite different, and the economic outputs are different too.
What do you mean by it?
Yeah, because the inputs are so cheap. On a forage-based diet, you don't have, your cost of gains is nearly zero. Well, it's not zero, but it's far less than it would be on a grain system. So if you're not changing the value of grass into lean beef, then you're missing an opportunity. An example, I was in Argentina. In Argentina, it's really fascinating. They have very traditional framed cattle, which is really interesting. So they haven't gone after all these big framed cattle, and that's simply an in-point issue, right? So most of their cattle are at 1,000 pounds, right? So they're a mature Angus cow, for example, down there would be 1,000 pounds, which means their steers are going to start to be finished at 900 to 1,000 pounds. That's a much different situation than in the United States. And the other thing is, and you know this better than I do, because of the inflation rate in somewhere like Argentina, their cattle are there as a cash asset because they're sold really in U.S. dollars.
Great. This is all great information. Thank you again, Dr. Gerrard. We're getting ready to wrap up this episode. And as a last question, what do you think about the future of the meat industry? What are your thoughts on this, about new technologies, new interventions?
Well, I'm not sure that I'm the best person to tell you where the meat industry is going in 20 years. I think there's a lot better folks probably in your part of the world that could tell you that. I've seen them change a lot. I've seen the production practices change a lot. I mean, and I don't think it's a big secret. The pork industry is completely vertically integrated. They were talking about that when I was in school, and that was going to change. I think that'll continue to change. I think you'll still see some creep on the size of pigs because of the indirects. You decrease your indirects on a weight basis. So I think that's going to continue to occur. I think we might rethink this whole cooling rate. I think that was a way to quick fix PSE, the occurrence of PSE. And I'm kind of wondering if we kind of went a little overboard on that. I also think that processing, we've got these lines so fast. Some of these processing lines are so fast. I mean, the idea is, what do you tell your packer? Get them dead and get them in the cooler as fast as possible. And I wonder, remember, we're dealing with a living tissue that's really sensitive to a lot of these things that happen to it. And I wonder if we haven't oversped them into the cooler. And some of our current data, we've got some data that suggests that might be the case, at least in pigs. But I don't know that I've got a crystal ball, Francisco. I think the research that's going on, certainly the meat-based research, is going to continue to revolve around shelf stability, at least on the fresh side. Processed side is going to be, more organic stuff. And then I think on the basic fundamental side, it's going to be data-driven kind of stuff. Well about that.
Yeah.
Sensors, whatever sensors we can use to monitor growth.
Yeah, to go get more information out of them that we can utilize to make decisions. Like they're gonna have an impact on the economics, and especially with that company, and because that may also drive prices down if we make it more efficiently. This was awesome. Thank you, Dr. Gerrard, for being here. A lot of information that I hope our audience benefit from. Thank you again. Appreciate your time. Thank you. Thank you for having the opportunity.
Oh, it was my pleasure, Francisco. Good luck with all your podcasts. This is my feeble attempt at social media.
Thank you.
With that, we end this episode. Thank you a lot for listening. If you'd like to receive notifications on the new releases and the new episodes, please subscribe at www.MeatsPad.com. If you're a small and mid-sized meat processor and you have concerns or questions about a certain topic related to meat science and meat processing, please email us at info@meatspad.com. Thank you, and see you the next time.